Section 27 of Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1 by Dr. John Doran. Chapter 1, The Coming of the Bride, continued. Between the wedding drawing-room and the coronation, the king and queen appeared twice in public, once at their devotions and once at the play. On both occasions there were crowds of followers and some disappointment. At the Chapel Royal, the preacher, the Reverend Mr. Schultz, made no allusion to the august couple, but simply confined himself to a practical illustration of his text, "Provide things honest in the sight of all men." It was a text from the application of which a young sovereign couple might learn much that was valuable, without being preached at, but the crowd who went to stare and not to pray would have been better pleased to have heard them lectured and to have seen how they looked under the inflection. The king had expressly forbidden all laudation of himself from the pulpit, but the Reverend Dr. Wilson and Mason the poet disobeyed the injunction, and getting nothing by their praise, joined the patriotic side in politics immediately. At the play, to which the king and queen went on the day after attending church to witness Garrick, who was advertised to play Bayes in the rehearsal, the king was in roars of laughter at Garrick's comic acting, which even made the queen smile, to whom, however, such a play as the rehearsal and such a part as Bayes must have been totally incomprehensible and defying explanation. No royal state was displayed on this occasion, but there were the penalties which are sometimes paid by a too eager curiosity. The way from the palace to the theatre was so beset by a violently loyal mob that there was difficulty in getting the royal chairs through the unwelcome pressure. The accidents were many, and some were fatal. The young married couple did not accomplish their first party of pleasure, shared with the public, but at the expense of 3 or 4 lives of persons trampled to death among the crowd that had assembled to view their portion of the sight. The St. James's Chronicle thus reports the scene which took place on the occasion of the royal visit to Drury Lane on Friday the 11th of September. Last night, about 6:15, their Majesties the King and Queen, with most of the royal family, went to Drury Lane Playhouse to see the rehearsal. Their Majesties went in chairs, and the rest of the royal family in coaches attended by the Horse Guards. His Majesty was preceded by the Duke of Devonshire, his Lord Chamberlain, and the Honourable Mr. Finch, his Vice-Chamberlain, and Her Majesty was preceded by the Duke of Manchester, her Lord Chamberlain, and Lord Cantilupe, her Vice-Chamberlain, the Earl of Harcourt, her Master of the Horse, and by the Duchess of Ancaster and the Countess of Effingham. It is almost inconceivable the crowds of people that waited in the streets, quite from St. James's to the Playhouse, to see their Majesties. Never was seen so brilliant a train, the ladies being mostly dressed in the clothes and jewels they wore at the royal marriage. The house was quite full before the doors were opened, so that out of the vast multitude that waited the opening of the doors, not 100 got in. The house being previously filled, to the great disappointment and fatigue of many thousands, and we may venture to say that there were people enough to have filled 50 such houses. There was a prodigious deal of mischief done at the doors of the house. Several genteel women who were imprudent enough to attempt to get in had their clothes, caps, aprons, handkerchiefs all torn off them. It is said a girl was killed and a man so trampled on that there are no hopes of his recovery. Among the congratulatory addresses presented to the Queen on the occasion of her marriage, there was none which caused so much remark as that presented by the ladies of St. Albans. They complained that custom had deprived them of the pleasure of joining in the address presented by the gentlemen of the borough, and that they were therefore compelled to act independently. They profited by the occasion to express a hope that the example set by the king and queen would be speedily and widely followed. The holy state of matrimony, the St. Albans ladies assured Her Majesty, had fallen so low as to be sneered at and disregarded by gentlemen. They further declared that if the best riches of a nation consisted in the amount of population, they were the best citizens who did their utmost to increase that amount, to further which end the ladies of St. Albans expressed a loyal degree of willingness, with sundry logical reasonings which made even the grave Charlotte smile. It is unnecessary, perhaps, to enter detailedly upon the program of the royal coronation. All coronations very much resemble each other. They only vary in some of their incidents. That of George and Charlotte had well nigh been delayed by the sudden and unexpected strike of the workmen at Westminster Hall. These handicraftsmen had been accustomed to take toll of the public admitted to see the preparations, But soldiers on guard, perceiving the profit to be derived from such a course, allowed no one to enter at all but after payment of an admission fee sufficiently large to gratify their cupidity. The plunderers of the public thereupon fell out, and the workmen struck because they had been deprived of an opportunity of robbing curious citizens. The dispute was settled by a compromise. An increase of wages was made to the workmen, and the military continued to levy with great success upon the purses of civilians, as before. Nothing further remained to impede the completion of the preparations for the spectacle, but by another strike, a portion at least of the public ran the risk of not seeing the spectacle at all. The chairmen and drivers of hired vehicles had talked so largely of their scale of prices for the coronation day that the authorities threatened to interfere and establish a tariff, whereupon the chairmen and their brethren solemnly announced that not a hired vehicle of any description should ply in the streets at all on the day in question, and that if there were a sight worth seeing, the full-dressed public might get to it how they could. They should not ride to it. Thereupon, great was the despair of a very large and interested class. Appeals, almost affectionate in expression, were made to the offended chairman who led the revolt, and they were entreated to trust the generous feelings of their patrons, willing to be their very humble servants for one day. The amiable creatures at last yielded, when it was perfectly understood that the liberal sentiment of riders was to be computed at the rate of £1 for a ride from the West End to the point nearest the Abbey, which the chairman could reach. Not many could penetrate beyond Charing Cross, where the bewildered fares were set down amid the mob and the mud to work their way through both as best they might. One class of extortionate robbers only succeeded in making unwarrantable gain without interference on the part of the authorities or appeal on that of the public. The class in question consisted of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, who exacted 5 guineas a foot as the rent or hire of the space for the erection of scaffolding for seats. This caused the tariff of places to be of so costly a nature that, willing as the public were to pay liberally for a great show, the seats were but scantily occupied. The popular eagerness which existed, especially to see the young queen, was well illustrated in the person of a married lady, for whom not only was a front room taken from the window of which she might see the procession pass, but a bedroom also engaged, and a medical man in attendance, the lady's condition of health rendering it probable that both might be required before the spectacle had concluded. Much had been said of the Queen's beauty, but to that Her Majesty had really little pretension. The public near enough to distinguish her features were the more disappointed, from the fact that the portrait of a very pretty woman had been in all the print shops as a likeness of the young Queen. The publisher, however, had selected an old engraving of a young beauty, and erasing the name on the plate, issued the portrait as that of the royal consort of His Majesty George III. Many were indignant at the trick, but few were more amused by it than Her Majesty herself. As illustrative of the crowds assembled, even on places whence but little could be seen, it may be mentioned that the assemblage on Westminster Bridge, which was no coign of vantage, for the platform on which the procession passed could hardly be discovered from it, was so immense as to give rise to a report which long prevailed that the structure of the bridge itself had been injured by this superincumbent dead weight. The multitude was enthusiastic enough, but it was not a kindly endowed multitude. The mob was ferocious in its joys in those days. Of the lives lost, one at least was so lost by a murderous act of the populace. A respectable man in the throngs dropped some papers, and he stooped to recover them from the ground. The contemporary recorders of the events of the day detail without comment how the mob held this unfortunate man forcibly down till they had trampled him to death. The people must have their little amusements. It was, perhaps, hardly the fault of the people that these amusements were so savage in character. The people themselves were treated as savages. Even on this day of universal jubilee, they were treated as if the great occasion were foreign to them and to their feelings. And a press gang, strong enough to defy attack, was not the least remarkable group which appeared this day among the Free Britons over whom George and Charlotte expressed themselves proud to reign. Such a gang did not do its work in a delicate way, and a score or two of loyal and tipsy people, who had joyously left their homes to make a day of it, found themselves at night battered and bleeding on board a tender torn from their families and condemned to serve the king upon the high seas. The interior of the abbey displayed, so says the St. James's Chronicle, the finest exhibition of genteel people that the world ever saw. That was satisfactory. The Countess of Northampton carried 300,000 pounds worth of diamonds upon her, and other ladies dropped rubies and other precious stones from their dresses in quantity sufficient to have made the fortune of any single finder. The day, too, did not pass without its ominous aspect, As the king was moving with the crown on his head, the great diamond in the upper portion of it fell to the ground, and was not found again without some trouble. Perhaps the prettiest, though not the most gorgeous portion of the show was the procession of the Princess Dowager of Wales from the House of Lords to the Abbey. The king's mother was led by the hand of her young son, William Henry. These and all the other persons in this picturesque group were attired in dresses of white and silver, and the spectators had the good sense to admire the corresponding good taste. The princess wore a short silk train and was consequently relieved from the nuisance of being pulled back by train-bearers. Her long hair flowed over her shoulders in hanging curls, and the only ornament upon her head was a simple wreath of diamonds. She was the best dressed and perhaps not the least happy of the persons present. The usual ceremonies followed. The Westminster boys sang Vivat Regina on the entry of the Queen into the Abbey, and Vivat Rex as soon as the King appeared. The illustrious couple, engaged for a time in private devotions, were presented to the people, and the divine blessing having been invoked upon them, they sat to hear a sermon of just a quarter of an hour in length, from Drummond, Bishop of Salisbury. The text was sermon in itself. It was from the 1 Kings chapter 9. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice. The episcopal comment was not a bad one, but when the prelate talked, as he did, of our Constitution being founded upon the principles of purity and freedom, and justly poised between the extremes of power and liberty, his sentiment was but purely illustrated by the presence of that press-gang without, with whom was much power over a people who, in such a presence, enjoyed no liberty. Secker, Archbishop of Canterbury, placed the crowns on the heads of the sovereigns, and did not get kissed in return, as was formerly the custom, at least on the part of a newly crowned king. But perhaps the prettiest incident took place when the king was about to partake with the queen of the sacrament. He desired that he might first put aside his crown and appear humbly at the table of the Lord. There was no precedent for such a case, and all the prelates present were somewhat puzzled, lest they might commit themselves. Ultimately and wisely they expressed an opinion that, despite the lack of authorizing precedent, the king's wishes might be complied with. A similar wish was expressed by Queen Charlotte, but this could not so readily be fulfilled. It was found that the little crown fixed on the queen's head was so fastened to keep it from falling, that there would be some trouble in getting it off without the assistance of the queen's dressers. This was dispensed with, and the crown was worn by the queen, but the king declared that in this case it was to be considered simply as part of her dress, and not as indicating any power or greatness residing in a person humbly kneeling in the presence of God. The remainder of the ceremonial was long and tedious, and it was quite dusk before the procession returned to the hall. In the meantime, the champion's horse was champing his bit with great impatience, as became a horse of his dignity. This gallant grey charger was no other than that which bore the sacred majesty of George II through the dangers of the great and bloody day at Dentington. The veteran steed was now to be the leader in the equestrian spectacle at the banquet of that monarch's successor. Although there was ample time for the completion of everything necessary to the coronation of George and Charlotte, the Earl Marshal forgot some very indispensable items. Among others, the sword of state, the state banquet chairs for the king and queen, and the canopy. It was lucky that the crown had not been forgotten, too. As it was, they had to borrow the ceremonial sword of the Lord Mayor, and workmen built a canopy amid the scenic splendors of Westminster Hall. These mistakes delayed the procession till noon. It was dark when the procession returned to the hall, and as the illuminating of the latter was deferred till the king and queen had taken their places, the cortege had very much the appearance of a funeral procession, nothing being discernible but the plumes of the Knights of the Bath, which seemed the hearse. There were less dignified incidents than these in the course of the day's proceedings. The least dignified was an awkward re-encounter between the Queen herself and the Duke of Newcastle behind the scenes. Walpole says that some of the procession were dressed overnight, slept in armchairs, and were waked if they tumbled on their heads. Noticing some of the ladies present, the same writer adds, "I carried my Lady Townshend, Lady Hertford, Lady Anne Connolly, my Lady Hervey, and Mrs. Clive to my deputy's house at the gate of Westminster Hall. My Lady Townshend said she should be very glad to see a coronation, as she had never seen one. 'Why,' said I, 'Madam, you walked at the last.' 'Yes, child,' she said, 'but I saw nothing of it. I only looked to see who looked at me.' The Duchess of Queensberry walked. Her affection that day was to do nothing preposterous. Lord Chesterfield was not present either in Abbey or Hall, for, as he said of the ceremony, he was not alive enough to march, nor dead enough to walk at it." The scene in the banqueting hall is further described by Gray and also by Walpole. Gray says of the scene in Westminster Hall, "The instant the Queen's canopy entered fire was given to all the lustres at once by trains of prepared flax that reached from one end to the other. To me it seemed an interval of not half a minute before the whole was in a blaze of splendor." And the most magnificent spectacle ever beheld remained. The king, bowing to the lords as he passed with his crown on his head and the scepter and orb in his hands, took his place with great majesty and grace. So did the queen with her crown, scepter, and rod. Then supper was served on gold plate. The Earl Talbot, Duke of Bedford, and Earl of Effingham in their robes, all three on horseback, prancing and curvetting like the hobby horses in the rehearsal, ushered in the courses to the foot of the Hautpas. Between the courses the champion performed his part with applause. "All the wines of Bordeaux," Walpole writes to George Montague, "and all the fumes of Irish brains cannot make a town so drunk as a royal wedding and a coronation. I am going to let London cool, and will not venture into it again this fortnight. Oh, the buzz, the prattle, the crowds, the noise, the hurry! Nay, people are so little come to their senses that, though the coronation was but the day before yesterday, the Duke of Devonshire had 40 messages yesterday desiring admissions for a ball that they fancied was to be at court last night. People had sat up a night and a day and yet wanted to see a dance. If I was to entitle ages, I would call this the century of crowds. For the coronation, if a puppet show could be worth 1,000,000, that is. The multitudes, balconies, guards, and processions made Palace Yard the liveliest spectacle in the world. The ball was most glorious. The blaze of lights, the richness and variety of habits, the ceremonial, the bunches of peers and peeresses, frequent and full, were as awful as a pageant can be. And yet, for the king's sake and my own, I never wish to see another, nor am impatient to have my Lord Effingham's promise fulfilled. The king complained that so few precedents were kept of their proceedings. Lord Effingham vowed the Earl Marshal's office had been strangely neglected, but he had taken such care for the future that the next coronation would be regulated in the most exact manner imaginable. The number of peers and peeresses present was not very great. Some of the latter, with no excuse in the world, appeared in Lord Lincoln's gallery, and even walked about the hall indecently in the intervals of the procession. My Lady Harrington, covered with all the diamonds she could borrow, hire, or seize, and with the air of Roxana, was the finest figure at a distance. She complained to George Selwyn that she was to walk with Lady Portsmouth, who would have a wig and a stick. "Foh," said he, "you will only look as if you were taken up by the constable." She told this everywhere, thinking that the reflection was on my Lady Portsmouth. Lady Pembroke alone, at the head of the countesses, was the picture of majestic modesty. The Duchess of Richmond, as pretty as nature and dress, with no pains of her own, could make her. Lady Spencer, Lady Sutherland, and Lady Northampton, very pretty figures. Lady Kildare, still beauty itself, if not a little too large. The ancient peeresses were by no means the worst party. Lady Westmoreland, still handsome and with more dignity than all. The Duchess of Queensberry looked well, though her locks are milk white. Lady Albemarle, very genteel, nay, the middle age had some good representatives in Lady Holderness. Lady Rochford and Lady Strafford, the perfectest little figure of all. My Lady Suffolk ordered her robes, and I dressed part of her head as I made some of my Lord Hertford's dress, for you know no profession comes amiss to me, from a tribune of the people to a habit-maker. Do not imagine that there were not figures as excellent on the other side. Old Exeter, who told the king he was the handsomest man she ever saw, old Effingham and Lady Say and Salley, with her hair powdered and her tresses black, were an excellent contrast to the handsome Lord B. put on rouge upon his wife, and the Duchess of Bedford in the painted chamber. The Duchess of Queensberry told me of the latter that she looked like an orange peach, half red and half yellow. The coronets of the peers and their robes disguised them strangely. It required all the beauty of the Dukes of Richmond and Marlborough to make them noticed. One there was, though of another species, the noblest figure I ever saw, the High Constable of Scotland, Lord Errol. As one saw him in a space capable of containing him, one admired him. At the wedding, dressed in tissue, he looked like one of the giants at Guildhall, New Gilt. It added to the energy of his person that one considered him as acting so considerable a part in that very hall where a few years ago one saw his father, Lord Kilmarnock, condemned to the block. The champion acted his part admirably and dashed down his gauntlet with proud defiance. His associates, Lord Effingham, Lord Talbot, and the Duke of Bedford, were woeful. Lord Talbot piqued himself on backing his horse down the hall, and not turning its rump towards the king, but he had taken such pains to dress it to that duty that it entered backwards, and at his retreat the spectators clapped, a terrible indecorum, but suitable to such Bartholomew fair doings. He had 20 demelles, and came off none creditably. He had taken away the table of the Knights of the Bath, and was forced to admit 2 in their old place, and dine the other at the court of request. Sir William Stanhope said, "We are ill-treated, for some of us are gentlemen." Beckford told the Earl it was hard to refuse a table to the City of London, whom it would cost £10,000 to banquet the king, and that his lordship would repent it if they had not a table in the hall. They had. To the barons of the Cinque Ports, who made the same complaint, he said, "If you come to me as Lord Stewart, I tell you it is impossible. If, as Lord Talbot, I am a match for any of you." And then he said to Lord Bute, "If I were a minister, thus would I talk to France, to Spain, to the Dutch. None of your half-measures." With all the solemnity there was some riot. A passage from a letter written by one James Hemming, quoted in Notes and Queries, 2nd section, volume 2, page 109, says, "Our friend Harry, who was upon the scaffold at the return of the procession, closed in with the rear, at the expense of half a guinea was admitted into the hall, got brimful of His Majesty's claret, and in the universal plunder brought off the glass Her Majesty drank in, which is placed in the Beaufort as a valuable curiosity. There was long a tradition current that among the spectators at the great ceremony in the hall was no less a person than the young Pretender, who was said to have been there incognito, and not without some hope of seeing the gauntlet, defiantly thrown down by the champion, taken up by some bold adherent of his cause. Indeed, it is further reported that preparation had been made for such an attempt, but that fortunately it accidentally failed. The Pretender, so runs the legend, was recognized by a nobleman, who, standing near him, whispered in his ear that he was the last person anybody would expect to find there. "I am here simply out of curiosity," was the answer of the wanderer, "but I assure you that the man who is the object of all this pomp and magnificence is the person in the world whom I least envy." To complete the chain of reports, it may be further noticed that Charles Edward was said to have abjured Romanism in the new church in the Strand in the year 1754. The night after the coronation there was an unusually grand ball at court. The Queen's bridesmaids danced in the white bodiced coats they had worn at the wedding. The Duke of Ancaster was resplendent in the dress which the King had worn the whole of the day before at the coronation, and which he had graciously ordered to be presented to the Duke, whose wife was the Queen's mistress of the robes. The King and Queen retired at 11 o'clock, not an early hour for the period. There was great gaiety in town generally at this period. The young Queen announced that she would attend the opera once a week. That seemed dissipation enough for her, who had been educated with some strictness in the quietest and smallest of German courts. The weekly attendance of royalty is thus commented upon by Walpole. "It is a fresh disaster to our box, where we have lived so harmoniously for 3 years. We can get no alternative but that over Miss Chudley's, and Lord Strafford and Lady Mary Coke will not subscribe unless we can. The Duke of Devonshire and I are negotiating with all our art to keep our party together. The crowds at the opera and play when the King and Queen go are a little greater than what I remember. The late royalties went to the Haymarket when it was the fashion to frequent the other opera in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Lord Chesterfield one night came into the latter and was asked if he had been at the other house. 'Yes,' he said, 'but there was nobody but the King and Queen, and as I thought they might be talking business, I came away.'" The theatres, of course, adopted the usual fashion of reproducing the ceremony of the coronation on the stage. Garrick, considering that he was a man of taste, displayed great tastelessness in his conduct on this occasion. After Henry VIII, in which Bensley played the king, Havard acted Wolsey, and Yates, what was so long played as a comic part, Gardiner, in which Mrs. Pritchard played the Queen, and Mrs. Yates, Anne Boleyn, a strange representation of the ceremonial was presented to the public. Garrick, it is said, knowing that Rich would spare no expense in producing the spectacle at the other house, and fearing the cost of competition with a man than whom the stage never again saw one so clever in getting up scenic effects till it possessed Farley, contented himself with the old mean and dirty dresses which had figured in the stage coronation of George II and Caroline. The most curious incident of Garrick's show was, that by throwing down the wall behind the stage, he really opened the latter into Drury Lane itself, where a monster bonfire was burning and a mob huzzaing about it. The police authorities did not interfere, and the absurd representation was continued for 6 or 7 weeks, till the indignation of the public, says Davis, put a stop to it, to the great comfort of the performers, who walked in the procession and who were seized with colds, rheumatism, and swelled faces, from the suffocation of the smoke and the raw air from the open street. Their Majesties did not witness the representation of the coronation at either house. Their first visit was paid to Drury Lane, when the Queen commanded the piece to be played, and her selection was one that had some wit in it. The young bride chose "Rule a Wife and Have a Wife." The royal visit took place on the 26th of November. At Covent Garden, Henry V with a coronation was acted 26 times, and Richard III with the same pageant was played 14 times. That exquisite hussy, Mrs. Bellamy, walked in the procession as a representative of the Queen. Their Majesties paid their first visit in state on the 7th of January, 1762. The King, with some recollection probably of his consort's bespeak at Drury Lane, commanded the Merry Wives of Windsor, so that in this respect the new reign commenced merrily enough. It had its bon mot. When some persons expressed surprise at the Queen having named Lady Northumberland one of the ladies of her bedchamber, Lady Townsend said, "Quite right. The Queen knows no English. Lady Northumberland will teach her the vulgar tongue." End of section 27.
Section 28 of Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alicia. Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1, by Dr. John Doran. Chapter 2. Court and City. The Levee. The King goes to Parliament. The first night of the opera. Garrick grievously offended. The King and Queen present on the Lord Mayor's Day. Entertained by Robert Barclay the Quaker. Banquet at Guildhall to the King and Queen. Popular enthusiasm for Mr. Pitt. Buckingham House purchased by the King for Queen Charlotte. Defoe's account of it. The Duke of Buckingham's description of it. West and his pictures. The house demolished by George IV. First illness of the King. Domestic life of the King and Queen. Royal carriage. Selwyn's joke of the royal frugality. Prince Charles of Strelitz. Costume. Graceful action of the Queen. Birth of Prince George. The entire population seems surprised at having got a young Queen and King to reign over them, and except on occasional placard or two, denouncing petticoat government and pronouncing against Scotch ministered and Lord George Sackville, there seemed no dissatisfied voice in the whole metropolis. The graces of the young sovereign were sung by pseudo-poets, and Walpole, in graceful prose, told of his surprise at seeing how completely the whole levee-room had lost its air of a lion-den. The sovereign don't stand in one spot, with his eyes fixed royally on the ground, and dropping bits of German news. He walks about and speaks to everybody. I saw him afterwards on the throne, where he is graceful and genteel, sits with dignity, and reads his answers to his address as well. It was the Cambridge address, carried by the Duke of Newcastle in his doctor's gown, and looking like the médecin malgré lui. He had been vehemently solicitous for attendance, for fear my Lord Westmoreland, who vouchsafes himself to bring the address from Oxford, should outnumber him. Lord Lichfield and several other Jacobites have kissed hands. George Selwyn says they go to St. James because there are so many Stuarts there. In allusion to the crowds of nobles, gentle and simple, going up to congratulate the king, or to view the processions flocking to the foot of the throne, or surrounding the king as it were, when he went to the first Parliament, Walpole remarks, "The day the king went to the House, I was 3/4 an hour getting through Whitehall. There were subjects enough to set up 6 petty kings. The Pretender would be proud to reign over the footmen only, and indeed, unless he acquires some of them, he will have no subjects left. All the masters flock to St. James's." In a few words he describes the scene of the theatre on the king's first visit alone. The first night the king went to the play, which was civilly on a Friday, not on the opera night, as he used to do. The whole audience sang God Save the King in chorus. For the first act, the press was so great at the doors that no ladies could get to the boxes, and only the servants appeared there who kept places. At the end of the second act, the whole mob broke in and seated themselves. The play was Richard III, in which Garrick represented the king. George III repeated his visit on the 23rd of December to see King John. His Majesty grievously offended Garrick on this night, by manifestation of what the latter considered very bad taste. The king preferred Sheridan and Falconbridge to Garrick and King John, and when this reached the ears of Garrick he was excessively hurt, and though the boxes were taken for King John for several nights, the offended Roscius would not allow the play to have its proper run. But there were other stages on which more solemn pageants had to be performed. The sovereigns had yet to make their first appearance within the city liberties. The Queen was introduced to the citizens of London on Lord Mayor's Day, on which occasion they may be said emphatically to have made a day of it. They left St. James's Palace at noon, and in great state, accompanied by all the royal family, escorted by guards, and cheered by the people, whose particular holiday was thus shared in common. There was the usual ceremony at Temple Bar of opening the gates to royalty and giving it welcome. And there was the once usual address made at east end of St. Paul's churchyard by the senior scholar of Christ's Hospital Church. Having survived the cumbrous formalities of the first, and smiled at the flowery figures of the second, the royal party proceeded on their way, not to Guildhall, but to the house of Mr. Barclay, the patent medicine vendor, an honest Quaker whom the king respected, and ancestor to the head of the firm whose name is not unmusical to the Volscian ears, Barclay, Perkins, and Co. Robert Barclay, the only surviving son of the author of the same name, who wrote the celebrated Apology for the Quakers, was an octogenarian, who had entertained in the same house 2 Georges before he had given welcome to the 3rd George and his Queen Charlotte. The hardy old man, without abandoning Quaker simplicity, went a little beyond it in order to do honor to the young queen, and he hung his balcony in rooms with a brilliant crimson damask that must have scattered blushes on all who stood near, particularly on the cheeks of the crowd of friends who had assembled within the house to do honor to their sovereigns. How the king, and he was at the time a very handsome young monarch, fluttered all the female friends present and set their tuckers in agitation, may be guessed from the fact that he kissed them all round, and right happy were they to be so greeted. The queen smiled with dignity, her consort laughed and clapped his hands, and when they had passed into another room, the king's young brothers followed the example, and in a minute had all the young Quakeresses in their arms. Nothing loath. Those were unceremonious days, and a kiss all around was a pleasant solemnity, which was undergone with alacrity even by a Quakeress. In the apartment to which the king and queen had retired, the latter was waited on by a youthful granddaughter of Mr. Barclay, who kissed the royal hand with much grace, but would not kneel to do so, a resolute observance of consistent principle which made the young queen smile. Later in that day, when Mr. Barclay's daughters served the queen with tea, they handed it to the ladies-in-waiting, who presented it kneeling to their sovereign, a form which Rachel and Rebecca would never have submitted to. From the window of this house, which was exactly opposite Bow Church, the queen and consort witnessed the Lord Mayor's procession pass on its way to Westminster, and had the patience to wait for its return. The Princess of Wales was a spectator of the show on this occasion, with her son King George and her daughter-in-law Queen Charlotte. Her husband, Frederick, Prince of Wales, once stood among the crowd in Cheapside to view the return of the mayor's procession to Guildhall. He was recognized by some members of the Saddlers' Company, by whom he was invited into their stand erected in the street. He accepted their invitation, and made himself so agreeable that the company unanimously elected him their master, an office which he accepted with great readiness. Queen Charlotte and George III were the last of our sovereigns who thus honored a Lord Mayor's show, and as it was the last occasion, and that the young Queen Charlotte was the heroine of the day, the opportunity may be profited by to show how the royal lady looked and bore herself in the estimation of one of the Miss Barclays, whose letter description of the scene appeared 47 years subsequently in 1808. About 1 o'clock, Papa and Mamma, with Sister Western to attend them, took their stand at the street door, where my 2 brothers had been long to receive the nobility, more than 100 of whom were then waiting in the warehouse. As the royal family came, they were conducted into one of the counting-houses, which was transformed into a very pretty parlor. At 2:30 their Majesties came, which was 2 hours later than they intended. On the second pair of stairs was placed our own company, about 40 in number, the chief of whom were of the Puritan order, and all in their orthodox habits. Next to the drawing-room doors were placed our own selves, Papa's children, none else, to the great mortification of visitors, being allowed to enter, for, as kissing the king's hand without kneeling was an unexampled honor, the king confined that privilege to our own family as a return for the trouble we had been at. After the royal pair had shown themselves at the balcony, we were all introduced, and you may believe at that juncture we felt no small palpitations. The king met us at the door, a condescension I did not expect, at which place he saluted us with great politeness. Advancing to the upper end of the room, we kissed the queen's hand, at the sight of whom we were all in raptures, not only from the brilliancy of her appearance, which was pleasing beyond description, but being throughout her whole person possessed of that inexpressible something that is beyond a set of features, and equally claims our attention. To be sure, she has not a fine face, but a most agreeable countenance, and is vastly genteel, with an air, notwithstanding her being a little woman, truly majestic, and I really think by her manner is expressed that complacency of disposition which is truly amiable, and though I could never perceive that she deviated from that dignity which belongs to a crowned head, yet on the most trifling occasions she displayed all that easy behavior that negligence can bestow. Her hair, which is of a light color, hung in what is called coronation ringlets, encircled in a band of diamonds, so beautiful in themselves and so prettily disposed as will admit of no description. Her clothes, which were as rich as gold and silver and silk could make them, was a suit from which fell a train supported by a little page in scarlet and silver. The luster of her stomacher was inconceivable. The king, I think, a very personable man. All the princes followed the king's example in complimenting each of us with a kiss. The queen was upstairs 3 times, and my little darling, with Patty Barclay and Priscilla Ball, were introduced to her. I was present, and not a little anxious on account of my girl, who kissed the queen's hand with so much grace that I thought the Princess Dowager would have smothered her with kisses. Such a report was made of her to the king that Miss was sent for, and afforded him great amusement, by saying that she loved the king, though she must not love fine things, and her grandpa would not allow her to make a curtsy. Her sweet face made such an impression on the Duke of York that I rejoiced she was only 5 instead of 15. When he first met her, he tried to persuade Miss to let him introduce her to the queen, but she would by no means consent till I informed her he was a prince, upon which her little female heart relented, and she gave him her hand, a true copy of the sex. The king never sat down, nor did he taste anything during the whole time. Her Majesty drank tea, which was brought her on a silver waiter by Brother John, who delivered it to the lady-in-waiting, and she presented it kneeling. The leave they took of us was such as we might expect from our equals, full of apologies for our trouble for their entertainment, which they were so anxious to have explained that the queen came up to us as we stood on one side of the door, and had every word interrupted. My brother had the honor of assisting the queen into her coach. Some of us sat up to see them return, and the king and queen took especial notice of us as they passed. The king ordered 24 of his guard to be placed opposite our door all night, lest any of the canopies should be pulled down by the mob, in which there were 100 yards of silk damask. Gog and Magog have never looked down on so glorious a scene and so splendid a banquet as enlivened Guildhall, at which the Queen and a consort were royally entertained at a cost of approaching £8,000. Both sovereigns united in remarking that, for elegance of entertainment, the city beat the court end of the town. A foreign minister present described it as a banquet such only as one king could give another, and it was precisely so. The king of the city exhibited his boundless hospitality to the king of England. The majesty of the people had the chief magistrate for a guest. The majesty of the people, however, if we may credit the Earl of Albemarle, the author of Memoir of the Marquess of Rockingham, and his contemporaries, was by no means so civil to the royal guests as the occasion warranted. On the 9th of November, George III, who had been married only 2 months, went in state with his youthful queen to dine with the Lord Mayor. It was their Majesties' first visit to the city. Mr. Pitt, yielding to Lord Temple's persuasions, and as he afterwards declared, against his better judgment, went with him in his carriage and joined the procession. Pitt, the great commoner, the terrible cornet of horse, hated and dreaded by Sir Robert Walpole, had only just resigned office, because he could not get his colleagues to agree with him in an aggressive policy against Spain, to be at war with which power was then a passion with the people. For this reason Pitt was their idol, and the court party their abomination. Hence the result of Pitt's joining the procession might partly have been anticipated. The royal bride and bridegroom were received by the populace with indifference, and Pitt's late colleague with cries of "No Newcastle salmon." As for Lord Bute, he was everywhere assailed with hisses and execrations, and would probably have been torn in pieces by the mob, but for the interference of a band of butchers and prize-fighters, whom he had armed as bodyguard. All the enthusiasm of the populace centered in Mr. Pitt, who was honored with the most hearty acclamations of people of all ranks, and so great was the feeling in his favor that the mob clung about every part of the vehicle, hung upon the wheels, hugged his footmen, and even kissed his horses. The royal bride must have been astonished, and the bridegroom was indignant at what, a few days after the banquet, he called the abominable conduct of Mr. Pitt. The court members of Parliament were directed to be offensive to him in the House, and all the fashionable ladies in town went to see the noble animal baited. The year of pageantry ended with matters of money. Parliament settled on Queen Charlotte £40,000 per annum, to enable her the better support the royal dignity, with a dowry of £100,000 per annum, and Richmond Old Park and Somerset House annexed, in case she should survive His Majesty. On the 2nd of December, the king went in state to the House to give the royal assent to the bill. The Queen accompanied him, and when the royal assent had been given, Her Majesty rose from her seat and curtsied to him with the grateful acknowledgments which were really due the representatives of the people who gave the money. Somerset House was but an indifferent town residence for either Queen or Queen Dowager, and the king showed his taste and gratified Queen Charlotte when, in lieu of the above-named residence, he purchased her the red-brick mansion which stood on the site of the present Buckingham Palace, and was then known as Buckingham House. It was subsequently called the Queen's House. The king bought it of Sir Charles Sheffield for £21,000, and settled it on his consort by an Act of Parliament obtained some years afterward. Therein were all the children born, with the exception of their eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, who was born at St. James's Palace, who demolished the old house in 1825 and erected on its site one of the ugliest palaces by which the site was ever offended. Queen Victoria has had some difficulty to make it a comfortable residence. To render it beautiful was out of the power of even Her Majesty's architect, Mr. Bloor. The edifice of his predecessor, Nash, defied all his efforts. In Queen Charlotte's time, Mr. Wyatt erected a grand staircase. West pictures soon filled the great gallery, and that artist, at least, would not complain, as so many others did, that the king and queen were mean patrons of art, seeing that the latter, to gratify his consort, paid West no less than £40,000 for his labors. Principal of these pictures are now at Hampton Court. The Regulus brought West a very liberal pension. The dining room was adorned with pictures by Zucchero, Van Dyck, Lely, Zeffani, Mitens, and Houseman. The Queen's house, although intended as a simple asylum for its royal owners from the oppressive gorgeousness and ceremony of St. James, did not lack a splendor of its own. The crimson drawing room, the second drawing room, and the blue velvet room were magnificent apartments, adapted for the most showy of royal pageants, and adorned with valuable pictures. Queen Charlotte had hardly been installed in this her own house when her husband commenced the formation of that invaluable library which her son, on demolishing her house, made over to the nation and is now in the British Museum. The son just alluded to was George IV. Under the pretense of being about to repair Buckingham House, he applied to the Commons to afford the necessary supplies. These were granted under special stipulation that repairs, and not rebuilding, were intended. The king and his architect, Nash, however, went on demolishing and reconstructing until the fine old mansion disappeared, and a hideous palace took its place, at a tremendous cost to the public. Neither of the children of Charlotte who lived to ascend the throne resided in this palace. The old building was a property of a queen consort. The new one was first occupied by a queen regent, the daughter of Charlotte's third son, Edward. The first great event in Queen Charlotte's life after she became mistress of Buckingham House was her becoming the mother of him who destroyed it, George Augustus Frederick, Prince of Wales. In 1762, Horace Walpole says, "The king and queen are settled for good and all at Buckingham House, and are stripping the other palaces to furnish it. In short, they have already fetched pictures from Hampton Court, which indicates their never living there. Consequently, Strawberry Hill will remain in possession of its own tranquillity, and not become a cheesecake house to the palace. All I ask," says the cynic in lace ruffles, "all I ask of princes is to not live within 5 miles of me." Even thus, early in the reign, the king's health gave rise to some disquietude. The king, writes Walpole to Man, had one of the last of those strong and universally epidemic colds, which, however, have seldom been fatal. He had a violent cough, an oppression of his breast, which he concealed just as I had. But my life was of no consequence, and having no physicians in ordinary, I was cured in fewer nights by James's powder without bleeding. The king was bloodied 7 times and had 3 blisters. Thank God he is safe, and we have escaped any confusion beyond what was ever known on the accession of the Queen of Scots. Nay, we have not even a successor born. Physically, who has lived long enough to remember nothing but the nonsense of the law, maintain, according to its wise tenets, that as the king never dies, the Duke of York must have been proclaimed king, and then be unproclaimed again on the Queen's delivery. We have not even any standing laws for the regency, but I need not paint you all the difficulties there would have been in our situation.
The difficulty was overcome. The king recovered. The royal couple lived quietly, and when they were disposed to be gay and in company, they already exhibited a spirit of economy, which may illustrate that saying that any virtue carried to excess becomes a vice. On the 26th of November, the Queen and King saw a few friends. The invitations only included 6 strangers, and the entire company consisted of not more than 12 or 13 couple. The 6 strangers were Lady Caroline Russell, Lady Jane Stewart, Lord Suffolk, Lord Northampton, Lord Mandeville, and Lord Grey. Besides these were the court habitués, namely the Duchess of Ancaster and her Grace of Hamilton. who accompanied the Queen on her first arrival. These ladies danced little, but on the other hand, Lady Effingham and Lady Egremont danced much. Then there were the 6 maids of honor. Lady Bolingbroke, who could not dance because she was in black gloves, and Lady Susan Stewart in attendance upon Lady Augusta. The latter was the eldest daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, at whose birth there had been such a commotion, and who was commonly called the Lady Augusta, in obedience to her father's wishes, who was fond of this old-fashioned English style of naming our princesses. The noblemen in waiting were Lords March, Eglinton, Cantilupe, and Huntingdon. There were no sitters by, except the king's mother, the Duchess of Bedford, and Lady Bute. At this select party, which commenced between 6:30 and 7, the king danced the whole time with the queen, and the Lady Augusta, future mother of the next Queen of England, with her 4 younger brothers. The dancing went on uninterrupted till 1 in the morning. The hungry guests separated without supper, and so ended the young couple's first, and not very hilarious, party. That young couple certainly began life in a prosaically businesslike way. To suit the king's convenience, one opera night was changed from Tuesdays to Mondays, because the former was post-day, and His Majesty too much engaged to attend, and the Queen would not have gone on Tuesdays without him. There was more questionable taste exhibited on other occasions. £8,000 was expended on a new state coach, which was a beautiful object crowded with improprieties. The mixture of palm trees and tritons was laughed at, the latter as not being adapted to a land carriage, the former as being a little aquatic, as the tritons were terrestrial. It was perhaps with reference to the Queen's first supperless party that Lord Chesterfield uttered a bon mot, when an addition to the peerage was contemplated. When this was mentioned in his presence, someone remarked, "I suppose there will be no duke's maid." "Oh, yes, there will," exclaimed Chesterfield. "There is to be one." "Is? Who?" "Lord Talbot. He is to be created Duke Humphrey, and there is to be no table kept at court but his." The young nobility, who had formed great expectations of the splendor and gaiety that were to result, as they thought, from the establishment of a new crown, with a young couple at the head of it, were miserably disappointed that pleasure alone was not the deity enshrined in the royal dwelling. To the Queen's palace they gave the name of Holyrood House, intending to denote thereby that it was the mere abode of chill, gloom, and meanness. But by this as it may, the English court was now the only court in Europe at which vice was discountered, and virtue set as an example and insisted on in others. With respect to the routine followed there, it certainly lacked excitement, but was hardly the worse for that. The Queen passed most of her mornings in receiving instruction from Dr. Mahandy in the English tongue. She was an apt scholar, improved rapidly, and though she never spoke or wrote with elegance, yet she learned to appreciate our best authors justly, and was remarkable for the perfection of taste and manner with which she read aloud. Needlework followed study, and exercise followed needlework. The Queen usually rode or walked in company with the King till dinner-time, and in the evening she played on the harpsichord or sang aloud, and this she could do almost en artiste. And she took share in a homely game of cribbage, and closed the innocently spent day with a dance. And so to bed, as Mr. Pepys would say, without supper. The routine was somewhat changed when Her Majesty's brother, Prince Charles of Stirlitz, became a visitor at the English court in February 1762. He was a prince short in stature, but well made, had fine eyes and teeth, and a very persuasive way with him. So persuasive, indeed, that he at one time contrived to express from the king £30,000 out of the civil list revenue, to pay debts that prince had contracted with German creditors. In the meantime, matters of costume, as connected with court etiquette, were not considered beneath Her Majesty's notice. Her birthday was kept on the 18th of January, to make it as distinct as possible from the king's, kept in June, and to encourage both winter and summer fashions. For the latter anniversary a dress was instituted of stiff-bodied gowns and bare shoulders, and invented, it was said, to thin the drawing-room, to be warmer, I hope, says Walpole in March. By the king's birthday or the ladies will catch their deaths. What dreadful discoveries will be made both of fat and lean. I recommend to you the idea of Mrs. Cavendish when half stark. Queen's drawing rooms, however, were generally crowded by the ladies, and no wonder, when 17 English and Scotch unmarried dukes might be counted at them. The especial birthday drawing room on the anniversary of the king's natal day was, however, ill-attended, less on the king's account than on that of his minister Lord Bute. Meanwhile, court was made to the queen by civility shown to his second brother who had come over to visit her, allured by affection and the success which had attended the elder brother. Lady Northumberland's fête to this wandering prince was a pompous festin. Not only the whole house, but the garden was illuminated, and was quite a fairy scene. Arches and pyramids of light alternately surrounded the enclosure. A diamond necklace of lamps edged the rails and descent, with a spiral obelisk of candles on each hand, and dispersed over the lawn with the little bands of kettle-drums, clarinets, fifes, and etc., and the lovely moon who came without a card. Queen Charlotte knew how to perform a graceful action gracefully as well as any queen who ever shared the throne. Thus Lady Bolingbroke, having been trusted by the Duchess of Bedford with a superb enamelled watch to exhibit to Her Majesty, the latter desired her to put it on, that she might be the better judge of its ornamental effect. She was obeyed, and thereupon she made a present of it to the lady, remarking that the watch looked so well upon her it ought to remain by Lady Bolingbroke's side. But the great event of the year was the birth of the heir apparent. It occurred at St. James's Palace on the 12th of August. In previous reigns, such events generally took place in the presence of many witnesses. But on the present occasion, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor alone were present in that capacity. Many rejoiced, writes Mrs. Scott, the sister of Elizabeth Montagu, but none more than those who happened detained all this hot weather in town to be present at the ceremony. Among them, no one was more impatient than the Chancellor, who, not considering any part of the affair as point of law, thought his presence very unnecessary. His lordship and the Archbishop must have had a fatiguing office, for as she was brought to bed at 7 in the morning, they must have attended all night, for fear they should be absent at the critical moment. I wish they were not too much out of humour before the prince was born to be able to welcome it properly. The royal christening will be, however, of more interest than details of the birth of the prince. The ceremony was performed in the Grand Council Chamber, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Right Reverend Midwife Thomas Secker, as Walpole calls him, officiating. Walpole, describing the scene on the day after, says, "Our next monarch was christened last night George Augustus Frederick, the Princess Dowager of Wales, the Duke of Cumberland, and the Duke Mecklenburg sponsors. The Queen's bed, magnificent and, they say, in taste, was placed in the drawing-room. Though she is not to see company in form yet, it looks as if they had intended people should have been there, as all who presented themselves were admitted, which were very few, for it had not been notified. I suppose to prevent too great a crowd. All I have heard named, besides those in waiting, were the Duchess of Queensberry, Lady Dalkeith, Mrs. Grenville, and about 4 other ladies. It was precisely at the period of the christening of this royal babe that the marriage of her, who was to be the mother of his future wife, was first publicly spoken of. In September, Walpole expresses a hope to his friend Conway that the hereditary Prince of Brunswick is recovering of the wound in his loins, for they say he is to marry the Princess Augusta. Walpole, however, would have nothing to do with the new Prince of Wales. With him, he says, I am positive never to occupy myself. I kiss the hand of his great-great-grandfather. Would it not be preposterous to tap a volume of future history of which I can never see but the first pages? Poor Queen Charlotte did not escape scandal. Less than 20 years after her death, a Monsieur Guillardier published, in 1836, a memoir of the celebrated Chevalier d'Eon, founded, it said, on family papers. In this book, the young Queen Charlotte was described in the year 1763 as giving interviews by night to the Chevalier, and the Prince of Wales just named was said to be their son. Many years after Gialdier's book had appeared, a Monsieur Jourdan published Un Hermaphrodite, which was a wholesome plagiarism from Gialdier. Jourdan denied this fact, when Gialdier declared that the whole story about the Queen and the Chevalier was pure fiction. Jourdan then affirmed that he had nothing to do with Un Hermaphrodite, and he had only put his name to it. In this way is calumny propagated. If we may judge from a letter written about this time by Mrs. Scott, the Queen was not a person to attract chevaliers. The Queen's person, she says, is not the only thing that displeases. There is a coarseness and vulgarity of manners that disgusts much more. She does not seem to choose to fashion herself at all. End of section 28. Section 29, Lives of the Queens of England, of the House of Hanover, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Aleeseeya. Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1, by Dr. John Doran. Chapter 3, Anecdotes and Incidents. Scenes and personal sketches of Queen Charlotte. Her fondness for diamonds. Visit to Mrs. Garrick, orphan establishment at Bedford founded by the Queen. Her benevolence on the breaking of the Windsor Bank. Marriage of Princess Caroline Matilda. Unfounded rumors about the Queen. Hannah Lightfoot. The King's illness. A regency recommended by the King. Discussions relative to it. Birth of Prince Frederick. Failing health of the Duke of Cumberland. In 1761, not a more gorgeously attired queen in presence of the public was to be found than ours. But we learn that in 1762, the first thing of which the Queen got positively wary was her jewels. At first, seeing herself endowed with them, her joy was girlish, natural, and unfeigned. But the gladness was soon over. It was the ecstasy of a week, as herself said a quarter of a century later, and there was indifference at the end of a fortnight. "I thought at first," said she, "I should always choose to wear them, but the fatigue and trouble of putting them on, and the care they required, and the fear of losing them, why, believe me, madam, in a fortnight's time I longed for my own earlier dress and wished never to see them more." This was said to Miss Burney, subsequently her dresser and reader, who adds that the Queen informed her that dress and shows had never been things she'd cared for, even in the bloom of her youth, and that neatness and comfort alone gave her pleasure in herself as in others. The Queen confessed that the first week or fortnight of being Queen, when only in her 17th year, she thought splendor sufficiently becoming her station to believe she should choose thenceforth constantly to support it. But it was not her mind, says Mrs. Burney, but only her eyes that were dazzled, and therefore her delusion speedily vanished, and her understanding was too strong to give it any chance of returning. This is pretty, but it has the disadvantage of not being exactly true. The Queen may have been indifferent for a while to the wearing or the value of diamonds, but later in life, if she did nurse a cherished passion, it was for these glittering gewgaws. The popular voice, at least, accused her of this passion, and before many years elapsed it was commonly said that no money was so sure to buy her favor as a present of diamonds. That she could, however, condescend to very simple tasks is well known. This is illustrated by her visit to Mrs. Garrick at Hampton. The Queen found the ex-actress engaging in peeling onions, and Charlotte sat down and, by helping her in her employment, saved her from the annoyance of being ashamed of it. In 1763, the country hailed the advent of peace and the retirement of Lord Bute from office. The Queen's popularity was greater than that of the King's, and even men of extremely liberal politics greeted her mild and tender virtues. She now encouraged trade by her splendid fêtes, and was one of those persons who, by enjoying festive grandeurs calmly, acquired a reputation for calmly despising them. In August 1763, she became the mother of a second prince, Frederick, afterwards Duke of York. One of the first acts of the Queen this same year was a graceful act of benevolence. The young mother had thought and a heart for young orphans of gentility. For parentless children of gentle blood, she established a home in Bedfordshire. At the head of the house was placed a lady who, with many comforts, enjoyed the liberal salary of £500 per annum. In return for this, she superintended the instruction of the young ladies, who were not admitted till they had attained the age of 15. Age of folly and of fermentation, as someone has called it, in embroidery. The first produce of their taste and toil was the property of their patroness, the young Queen, and was converted into ornaments for window curtains, chairs, sofas, and bed furniture for Windsor Castle and the Queen's house in St. James's Park. This was perhaps rather a calculating benevolence, for the Queen paid £500 a year for 50 years for it, and Her Majesty was not wanting in true charity. In a later period of her reign, the middle classes of Windsor were thrown into much misery by the breaking of the bank there. Many individuals of the class alluded to held the £1 notes on this bank, and the paper had now no more value than as paper. The Queen, on hearing the case, ordered her treasurer to give cash for these notes on their being presented, and this was done to the extent of £400. Her daughters acted as clerks, and never was there so hilarious a run upon the banks as on this royal house at Windsor. The year 1765 opened in some sense auspiciously with the royal marriage. Caroline Matilda was the posthumous daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and was born in July 1751. The terms of her marriage with Christian, Crown Prince of Denmark, were settled in January of this year, but on account of the extreme youth of the contracting parties, they were not carried into effect until 2 years had elapsed. Meanwhile, the young bride, who had been remarkable for her beauty, grace, and elegance, and above all her vivacity, seemed almost to fade away, so nervously anxious did she become as to the obligation by which she was bound and its possible results. Before the espousals were completed, her affianced husband had become King of Denmark, and when Queen Charlotte congratulated her sister-in-law, she little thought of the hard fate that was to follow upon the ceremony. As for the following year, it was a time of much anxiety and distress, and the people were scarcely good-humoured enough in 1765 to welcome the birth of a third prince in the person of William Henry, afterwards Duke of Clarence. The reports circulated at this time to the effect that the Queen interfered in state affairs were discredited by those who certainly did not lack the means of getting at the truth. The rumour appears to have been believed by Mr. Stanhope, but Lord Chesterfield, in writing to his son, and noticing his belief in the good foundation of such rumour, says, "You seem not to know the character of the Queen. Here it is. She is a good woman, a good wife, a tender mother, and an unmeddling queen. The king loves her as a woman, but I verily believe has never yet spoken one word to her about business." The reports regarding her were at once atrocious and absurd. They were the falser because they spoke of her having insisted on a repetition of her marriage ceremony with the king, and that the same was performed by Dr. Wilmot at Kew Palace. The motive for this proceeding was ascribed to the alleged fact of the death of Hannah Lightfoot, with whom rumour was resolved that the king had been wedded, and now a legal marriage might be solemnized between the Queen and himself. The atrocity of rumour was illustrated by a report that in consequence of an attack of illness which had affected, for a short time, the king's mental faculties, the Queen, armed with a law which, in the case of an interruption in the exercise of the royal authority, gave a power of regency to Her Majesty, or other members of the royal family, assisted by a council, had exercised the most unlimited sway over the national affairs to the injury of the nation. The only part of this which is true is where the king's illness is referred to. That he had been mentally affected was not known beyond the palace and to but a very few within it. He went with the Queen to Richmond in the month of April, announcing an intention to spend a week there, but on the third day he appeared unexpectedly at the levee held by the Queen. This was so contrived in order to prevent a crowd. He was at the drawing-room on the following day, and at chapel on Good Friday. He looked pale, but it was the fixed plan to call him well, and far-seeing people hoped that he was so. His health was considered as very precarious, but what was chiefly dreaded was consumption. He acted with promptitude in this matter by going down to the house, and in an affecting and dignified spirit urging the necessity of appointing a regency, in case of some accident happening to himself before the heir apparent should become of age. The struggle of this bill was one of the most violent which had ever been carried out by two adverse factions. By a mere juggle practiced on the king, the clause of the bill passed by the Lords, after some absurd discussion as to what was meant by the royal family, excluded his mother, the Princess Dowager of Wales, as though she were not a member of it. The struggle was as fierce in the Commons, for ministers dreaded lest, with the Princess Dowager, they might get her protégé Lord Bute for king. The political antagonists professed a super-excellence of what they did not possess, patriotism. And after a battle of personalities, the name of the Princess Dowager was inserted next after that of the Queen, whom some were desirous to exclude altogether, as capable, with certain assistants named, of exercising the power of regency, and the Lords adopted the bill which came to them thus amended. The Queen, it is hardly necessary to observe, had no opportunity under this bill to exercise any present power, had she been ever so inclined. It was only in after years that her enemies made the accusations against her, when they wanted the memory which mendacious persons are said to chiefly require, with respect to the desired admission of the name of the king's mother from the regency. It was fixing on her a most unmerited stigma. The attempt to prove that she was not of the royal family was to say, in other words, she was not akin to her own son. It is not known whether the Queen herself thought so, nor did people care what a fiction of law might say thereupon. The Princess Dowager's name was placed next to that of Queen Charlotte in the new Regency Bill. There is little more personal detail connected with the Queen this year that is of much interest. Her eldest son already wore a long list of titles, had been honored with the Order of Garter, and returned brief answers to loyal deputations. He was born twice a Duke, once an Earl and Baron, and Lord High Steward of Scotland. He was Duke of Cornwall and Rothesay, Earl of Carrick, and Baron of Renfrew, and a few days after his birth, his mother smiling laid upon his lap the patent whereby he was created Prince of Wales. His brother Frederick had been, ere he could speak, named Bishop of Ottenburg, and Queen were equally hurt by the chapter, who acknowledged their dotion, but refused to entrust to him the irresponsible guardianship of the episcopal funds. The Queen's thoughts were drawn away from this matter for a moment by the birth, already noticed, of William Henry on the 21st of August, the second of her children destined to ascend the throne. This was the little prince who so delighted the good Mrs. Chapone, and by his engaging ways won the heart of Dr. Thomas, Bishop of Winchester. But while some princes were flourishing, others were fading. The health of the Duke of Cumberland, the dearly loved son of Caroline, had long been precarious. As early as April in this year, his favourite sister, Amelia, residing at Gunnersbury, had felt much alarm on his account. The Duke of Cumberland is actually set out for Newmarket today. He, too, is called much better, but it is often true of the health of the princes as of their prisoners, that there is little distance between each and their graves. There has been lately a fire at Gunnersbury, which burned 4 rooms. Her servants announced it to Princess Amelia, with that wise precaution of, "Madam, do not be frightened." Accordingly, she was terrified. When they told her the truth, she said, "I am very glad. I had expectation my brother was dead." The expectation seemed natural, A few months more only were to elapse before he who was so overpraised for his generalship at Culloden, and so over-censured for his severity after it, was summoned to depart. End of section 29. End of Lives of the Queens of England of the House of Hanover, Volume 1, by Dr. John Doran.